And so I would like you to imagine 25% youth unemployment and how easy it would be for everybody to blame the people who bombed their homes.
Mm.
And put yourself in the shoes really briefly of an Iraqi citizen who does not understand why we showed up, or did understand why we said we were going to show up, and then we didn't do the things we promised them, like build educational centers. Instead, we bombed hospitals. Instead, we did Abu Ghraib, and we posted pictures on the internet. And imagine where some of the emotions and feelings of hopelessness are being routed to.
Mm-hmm.
And some of geo-international politics might make a little bit more sense. Everybody, we're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Kristen.
I'm Dr. Erin.
You are very welcome to our Colonizers World Tour coverage of the country of Iraq. We are in Book 2, Chapter 1, which is Global Women's Voices. And this is the final entry into this particular chapter. We'll be moving on next month to something different. We want to acknowledge right up front that Dr. Erin and I are recording this in March of 2022.
Yeah.
Which means that talking about a sovereign nation being invaded feels a little bit different than it might have a month ago.
Mm-hmm.
So we just want to call out that there's a lot of parallels between the American invasion of Iraq in the early 2000s and the current Russian invasion of Ukraine happening right now.
Mm.
We will not delve into those things, but we want to be honest that some of our commentary might be colored by that reality that we are living in.
Yeah.
Just want to acknowledge that right up front.
Very important.
So the first thing we always do when it comes to Colonizer World Tour is talk about what we knew. So Dr. Erin, before we started this, what did you know about Iraq?
Yeah, so I mean, not a lot. And everything that I learned was through the lens of the American invasion in 2003 and what I vaguely remembered of the Gulf War from when we were like, well, 9 or something, 8 or 9. So I remember it happening on the television. I remember hearing about Saddam Hussein, but it was always through the American lens and through the lens of the invasion. So anything I learned was framed within like war and conflict. So like almost nothing about the history of Iraq and its peoples and cultures and any of that. So I was excited that we were doing this so that I could reframe that lens. How about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, like, just like with Afghanistan, I have friends who served over there in the more current conflict, though the one that we ended more recently. But yeah, I remember watching Operation Desert Storm on television. I have a very vivid memory of sitting in our house in Maryland.
Yeah.
And my parents explaining to me what was happening. Although in my memory, like, Desert Storm lasted at least 5 years, and I just found out it was like 6 weeks. So
I know.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that was an interesting thing that we learned this week. Yeah.
But beyond that, I mean, not only just talking to my friends, but then even with the American lens, it's not hard to figure out that things aren't great. When you destroy a country's entire infrastructure after you put them under international sanctions, it's not great. Like, it's just not great. And so that I was eager to learn if there were pieces I was missing. And there definitely were. I definitely learned a lot more about the ISIL, ISIS, Daesh, whatever language we're talking about them in, invasion of the Yazidi and the Kurds up in the north. I definitely learned more about that. And it's been interesting to talk to some of my people in my parents' age range of what they remember of Saddam and their opinions and views on mustard gas and all of those things.
Yeah.
And I'm grateful for it. But before we get too much further, it's time to go to the map. So for anyone who doesn't know, just a heads up, Iraq's in the Middle East. It's kind of the cradle of the Middle East, the cradle of civilization. The Tigris and the Euphrates rivers are in modern day Iraq. It borders the Persian Gulf. It's between Iran and Kuwait. I know that when we invaded in 2001, 2, 3, whenever that was, lots and lots of people were mixing up Iran and Iraq, and I'm sure they still do. So we've had the privilege of covering Iran already. We'll be linking to that coverage in the show notes to make sure that you don't mix them up like a lot of people do. But they are right next to each other. They both start with I, and we don't learn about them in school. So that's why we're doing this today. We've got a little under 40 million people living in modern day Iraq. I would ask a lot of questions about record keeping, especially once again when you've been invaded after international sanctions. The biggest cities are Baghdad, Mosul, and Basra. About 71% of people live in one of these urban centers. The other fun fact is that Baghdad is the second largest city in the Arab world besides Cairo. I already have the amount of people in Cairo gives me post-COVID hives. So I can't imagine what Baghdad would be like. They've got a couple languages, official languages: Arabic, Kurdish, Turkmen, which is a Turkish dialect, I believe, of Arabic. Syriac and Armenian are all officials in areas where these native speakers have a huge majority of the population. I should say we have not covered the Armenian people and the Armenian genocide that was perpetrated, and I'm not sure what country it's going to fall under. My guess is when we get to Lebanon. But know that we're aware of that, and we haven't tied it to a country yet. But we definitely need to talk about Armenians and the ethnic history there. Speaking of ethnic and indigenous folks in Iraq, we got mostly ethnically Arab peoples. And then right behind that, we're clocking in 75 to 80%. And then the biggest group behind them is Kurdish folks. And Dr. Aaron's going to talk about the Kurds a little bit more, just really quickly. They are the most famous unknown people group in the world. I find that to be the most fascinating sentence that Dr. Aaron found. They're split between Turkey, Iraq, and Iran. They had an overwhelming... So you see Iraqi Kurdistan if you watch some of the geography videos, or Eleanor might pop the map back on here now and highlight Iraqi Kurdistan. I thought it was a different country. It's not. It's not. No. But the people voted in 2017 to make it a different country. And a whole lot of people were like, we need your oil, so no. I've mentioned sanctions a bunch, and one of the side effects of that, they were in international sanctions for 15 years after the gassing of the Kurds by Saddam Hussein, means that their currency is still, weak is a kind word. It's 1,500 dinars to a US dollar.
Eesh.
1,500. That's got to be one of the worst we've hit since Mozambique, I think. Honestly, it's I have so many feelings on their economy and their infrastructure, but just 1,500 dinar about. So the system of government is a federal parliamentary republic. There was a few years there where the Brits kind of set up a fake monarchy because the Brits, but they've been a republic since 1958. The legal system is a mix of civil and Islamic law. This is one of those things that a lot of very... fear-based American television programs will highlight about Iraq as one of the reasons it is so quote-unquote backwards or quote-unquote evil, or pick a word. Sharia law is not inherently evil or backwards or anything else. It is a law. It is a system of laws, just like American democracy. The way that ISIS in particular has used Sharia law, I have no problem as labeling as evil. But that doesn't mean that Sharia law itself is. So we need to be really careful about drawing conclusions, especially those of us who maybe have never read a word of the Quran. Tucker Carlson. So thank you so much. In terms of religion, it's super duper Muslim. 95 to 98% of people, it's super duper Muslim. There's a really interesting split, and this is where a lot of the drama in Iraq comes from. Almost all of the internal conflicts come from the drama between Shia and Sunni Muslims. We are not qualified to talk at length about them, but good news, so many people are. Please check the show notes for lots of great explanations as to the differences and the historical differences and why and everything else. What I would like to bring up really briefly is that the United States, Christians, evangelicals in the United States, have been making a lot of noise recently about persecuted Christians in Iraq. Y'all, they're not joking. It's a problem. It's a real problem. It has, there is not a freedom of religion in Iraq. There isn't a freedom of conscience. There isn't a freedom of choice. So the Yazidis, which is a separate religion, are under attack. Christians are under attack. In certain sectors, if you're the opposite type of Muslim, under attack. There are other kinds of Islam that are also under attack from the dominant Islamic groups. So I want to take that and just say it's not great. However, the persecution of Christians is a problem. That there are actually people losing their lives, being like driven over by steamrollers and things. Like, it's a real issue. But the larger issue is that there is no freedom of choice, full stop, in Iraq in a lot of situations, especially for people who are not in power. And Dr. Aaron's going to get into human rights in a little bit and the history of colonization. So am I really upset about the martyrdom of Iraqi Christians? Absolutely. Am I even more upset that like no one can get water? Kind of, to be completely honest. So just to put that in context. So let's talk about the economy. Everything is oil. Everything is oil. 85% of the government revenue and 80% of foreign exchange earnings come from oil.
Yep.
Y'all.
It's a lot of oil.
A lot of oil. They got really screwed by UN sanctions. I want to be clear, too, that it was the whole United Nations that sanctioned them, not just the United States. I see that misreported a lot. When they invaded Kuwait, the United Nations was like, hey, we're not having this. And they imposed some real fierce sanctions that Saddam just did not care about. And did not seem to bother him. And he did not make moves necessarily to lift those sanctions. So the sanctions were kind of lifted, kind of not, and then the U.S. invaded. Mm-hmm. And if you know anything about about how money works, all of that means that was no capital for people to rebuild things after the U.S. invaded. We've been gone for 11 years, 12 years? We left in 10, I think.
10, 11?
10, 11, I think. And there's still a lack of capital, especially outside of Baghdad, to be able to rebuild things. Also, there's a massive amount of overregulation. This is typical in any oil-based economy. We see it in Saudi Arabia. We see it in Iran. We see it in Colombia in some ways, too. There's massive overregulation, lots of red tape. You hear talks of bribes. You hear talks of a lot of, old man boys club, wink, wink, nudge, nudge type of stuff. And so change is very, very challenging.
Yeah, I mean, any place where there's been that kind of high level of societal disruption for such a long time is just rife with corruption. We see that everywhere.
Yeah, that's a common trope in human life. In terms of education, which is the next thing we always talk about, there's no data on how much the government spends on it, which is not a good sign. No. It's not a good sign. Mm-mm. They claim that 85% of the population over 15 can read and write. They don't tell us in what language. And they don't tell us to what extent. And there's a difference between reading, writing, and comprehension.
And they don't talk about gender.
There's no conversation about gender. So, let's put a pin in that. Demographics-wise, this is my last section before I turn it over to Dr. Aaron. It's a young country, much like everywhere that's been at war for so long and has been in violent circumstances. It's always a young country. About 55% of the population currently between 15 and 54, with the average age being 20. At no point in any of the English writings about Iraq did I find talk of forgotten generations, but someone should be talking about the fact that they essentially lost 2 solid generations, especially of men, to the conflicts. They've just lost them. And so that's a real thing. About 23% of the citizens live below the poverty line, and those are the ones that count, quote unquote. So I don't think Kurds are in this statistic, for instance, according to the government, since Kurds don't really count. And there's about 25% youth unemployment. I will say this here. Dr. Aaron has a friend who I have also claimed, whether he likes it or not, who grew up in Derry in the 60s in Northern Ireland, and frequently says people don't become radical by religion. They become radical when you bomb their homes. And so I would like you to imagine 25% youth unemployment and how easy it would be for everybody to blame the people who bombed their homes. Mm. and put yourself in the shoes really briefly of an Iraqi citizen who does not understand why we showed up, or did understand why we said we were going to show up, and then we didn't do the things we promised them, like build educational centers. Instead, we bombed hospitals. Instead, we did Abu Ghraib, and we posted pictures on the internet. And imagine where some of the emotions and feelings of hopelessness are being routed to. Mm. And some of geo-international politics might make a little bit more sense.
Okie dokie, Smokey. You done?
Yeah, over to you for human rights.
Awesome. Let's move on to human rights. Again, we can say a lot of things about a country that has been in this level of turmoil for this long. It's not great. Unsurprisingly, we see a high increase in intimate partner violence since the start of COVID. That is happening everywhere.
That's global. Yeah, I haven't seen a single country that stat hasn't spiked.
That hasn't spiked, for sure. They have a 52% contraceptive prevalence rate, which is, again, not great. There are no protections against discrimination against LGBTQ plus folks. They are wishy on homosexuality, like it's not illegal, but it's not protected. Gay marriage is not recognized. They have a really severe localized level of food insecurity. 4.1 million Iraqis are in acute humanitarian need due to crisis, so like civil crises, low oil prices, water issues, general levels of BS. I learned so much about the huge problem of accessing clean water, which I obviously have couched into a human rights crisis. 81% of Iraq's water is controlled by its neighbors.
What?
81% of its water sources are controlled by its neighbors, especially Turkey and Syria, which have, because that's where the Tigris and the Euphrates start. So the Tigris starts in Turkey and the Euphrates starts in Syria. And so they have dammed the Tigris and the Euphrates. So only 25% of the Euphrates' normal flow reaches Iraq. This is what I learned. This is nuts, y'all. And like dams all along in Turkey and Syria over the last 20 years. And so it's supposed to, the Tigris and Euphrates go all the way down to the Persian Gulf. Like they meet and they form a river, which I'm not going to remember. And then that river goes through, like, into Basra, which is the port city in the Persian Gulf. Also, Saddam destroyed a lot of water infrastructure, and then we destroyed a lot of their water infrastructure, both with the Gulf War and the 2003 invasion. So it's the weaponization of water, which is an actual term I did not know until, I was a week old when I learned that term. Yeah. It's the weaponization of water. And then we bring in the ISIL of it all. They have also weaponized the water flow by controlling strategic dams, poisoning water supplies, etc. So there's a huge lack of data transparency to know what is actually happening in Iraq. Like, especially now that we're in this, like, insurgency period post-American withdrawal. But there's a couple links below, specifically stories about the lack of water access and what the river looks like that goes through Basra in terms of the low level of water and the pollution in it and the trash. And that's, you can just extrapolate. Like, I think that's what was interesting for me for focusing on water for a minute, was then to extrapolate all the other problems you have if you don't have access to clean water, which is a privilege so many of us take for granted in so many parts of the world. All right, colonization, last one up. Fascinatingly, this is actually a short history. Iceland was kind of long. Ireland, it was like 25 minutes. This is a short history of occupation, not colonization. and I'll explain the difference. In the 19th century, mostly British Europeans took an interest in exploring and spying on and trading in Mesopotamia, which was the region that became later-day Iraq. At the start of the First World War, they were anxious about those beautiful Persian oil fields, and they were like, oh, we don't want the bad guys to control them. And this is just another helpful reminder that all forms of colonization and occupation are about controlling resources and access to resources. The Ottoman Empire, which was in control of Mesopotamia, sided with Germany in the First World War, and thus was an enemy of Britain and France and the other Allied forces. So this led to the Allied operations in the Ottoman Empire and the eventual military defeat and surrender of the Ottoman Empire in 1918. So that is the land where Iraq is now. The Ottoman Empire was in control of it, what was previously to the empire, Mesopotamia. At the end of the war, Britain controlled 3 provinces in that area: Baghdad, Basra, and Mosul. Obviously, as we told you, those are where the largest cities are. So that's where they focused their efforts. And then the Brits, being the Brits, decided that they had to decide the future of all those humans because they were in control of it. So with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the Arab provinces were in limbo, and the Brits were granted a mandate from the League of Nations to govern Iraq in 1920. The mandate united these 3 provinces under the imported Hashemite ruler King Faisal. So this is what Dr. Kristen referenced when she meant the fake monarchy. They just created a constitutional monarchy. So they were like, well, that's what we have, so that's what you should have. So we're going to bring in this foreigner, King Faisal, and make him the king of Iraq. Good luck. Very typically British. Then also they pieced out after that. They were like, we've given you a monarchy. It's all sunshine and rainbows from here. We'll see y'all later. But they didn't really want to control or govern the new state, which is why I'm not calling it colonization, because they weren't interested in taking over culturally. They didn't really want to govern the state. They just wanted the oil. They just wanted access to the oil. And so, which was mostly held in the Mosul province in the north. And they wanted it as a strategic outpost to protect interests in the Persian Gulf and India. If you remember, in the Middle East. And then we talked about the Brits in India quite extensively earlier this month. So they remained a satellite for Britain until they signed a treaty in 1930. But then the Brits were like, we'll give you formal independence, which happened in 1932. But as Dr. Kristen said, they didn't become an independent republic until 1958. So the Brits kind of held on to them in terms of imperially influencing them until after the end of the Second World War. Obviously, then they were kind of a lot of independence movements. We had the partition states of India and Pakistan. So after the Second World War, the Brits were like, we'll let go of some of this stuff, and you can finally have your actual independence in 1958. So then after that, they joined the UN. They were founding members of the Arab League. And in 1958, finally, they overthrew the monarchy with a bloodless coup and established an Arab nationalist country. We love to talk about coups here on Colonizers World Tour. They are like a side effect of colonization. So many coups. So we had a good many between 1963 and 1973, and then Saddam took over in 1979, and he effectively installed an autocratic dictatorship. He was really ambitious, which is polite, and led to an economic boom in the 1970s, but then he put Iraq in some really horrible conflicts in the 80s. There was the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988, and then the Gulf War and the Kuwait invasion from 1990 to 1991. And then, we're butting up against a lot of what Dr. Kristen talked about in terms of the sanctions and the impact on the economy and the infrastructure and the governance of Iraq for the 1990s, and then obviously into the 2000s we get the American invasion, which lasted until we withdrew our troops in 2011, and we had the rise of the insurgency after, with the rise of ISIS and now Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And we've got some great videos in the show notes that explain Iraq's relationship in the Middle East and these wars that are happening. And we talked about it when we talked about Afghanistan, and we talked about it when we talked about Iran. So the proxy wars, the use of insurgency by Iran and Saudi Arabia, and all of this. It's very, very complicated, but friends of ours on the internet have helped us out with some good. There's one that's like, understanding ISIS in 6 minutes or something. And you actually do, to a certain degree. So where we are today is not a great spot, which is where we started this. We're going to get into more discussion tomorrow about kind of contemporary Iraq in the last 20 or 30 years. But suffice to say, when you have violent conflict for the better part of 4 decades, if we include the Iran-Iraq war in the 80s, things aren't stable, unfortunately, for a lot of Iraqi folks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, there's lots and lots of smart people in foreign policy that talk about where Iraq can go from here.
Yeah.
And we are not those people.
Nope.
So all we will say is that our deep hope is that the people of Iraq, whatever their tribe, get the future they want. That would be our hope.
Our hope is peace and stability, I think, always.
Yeah. Yeah. So what's the Jeopardy fun fact for you here, Dr. E?
Oh, I had some fun ones. I learned what the word Mesopotamia means. It means land between the Tigris and Euphrates. Meso, in between, middle, and Potamia is like between rivers. So I did not know that. And 75% of Iraqis live on the narrow land between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. So, like, Eleanor, if you could put up the map, like, one more time and maybe, like, highlight the rivers. It's a real narrow part of Iraq, and I did not understand that. Also, I learned that they make up their own, like, knockoff American fast food restaurants. So they have one. Their Burger King version is called Burger Friends.
Love it. I want a burger friend.
I know. I want to go to Baghdad and go to Burger Friends. That would make me so happy. And then I would immediately leave. What was your Jeopardy fun fact?
There's a Quran written entirely in Saddam Hussein's blood. That one just sticks out.
I feel like that's, like, you could not know anything else about Saddam Hussein. And if you learned that fact, you would know so much.
Yeah. This is exactly what people felt about him.
It's massive too. Like in the video and the
huge.
show notes, like it takes up a huge display case because the Quran there's a lot of pages.
The Quran is long.
It's long. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's got to be like top 5 all time Jeopardy fun fact on Colonizer's World Tour, man.
Seriously.
It's a nutty thing.
We already, over on Abby Research Reads, I did a review of a book called The Beekeeper, which talks a lot about in the particular kind of invasion of ISIS into the northern parts of Iraq during like 2014, 2015, 2016. And it's a wonderful book. So if you want to hear more from a voice that is actually Iraqi and therefore much more authoritative than ours, make sure to pick up that book. It's very difficult to find Iraqi voices published in English. It's very challenging. So I'm very grateful for the Google searching that finally led me to that book. Tomorrow, we will be, we have the privilege of sitting for an hour with Iraqi women's voices in particular. And we will be talking about a documentary literally called, like, Voices of Iraq.
Yeah.
So it's really straightforward. It was shot in 2005, 2006?
2006, I think. It's hard to tell. Yeah. But it was, as you say, very difficult to find any story about Iraq that wasn't from the American lens about the invasion. even harder to find one with women. So you did a yeoman's job to find this documentary for us, which I think was bought by Channel 4 or like aired by Channel 4 in the UK. But now it's on some random YouTube channel. Bless YouTube.
Yeah, we found it on documentaryhaven.com. So
yes.
Amazing. So we'll see you guys tomorrow for that conversation. As always, if you are Iraqi, Iraqi American, Iraqi hyphen anything else, Iraqi, and you would like to comment on this video, we welcome that, as always. If you enjoyed the conversation, please hit the thumbs up, because that algorithm really does help. Subscribe to the channel, do all the YouTube-y things, and we would love to hear your thoughts, even if you're not Iraqi, on what you think and learned underneath this video. And we will see you next time.
Bye, everybody.